Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined again by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran and a former senior advisor to the US Secretary of Defense, to discuss some of the NATO military activities in the Arctic. So I'm seeing from the headlines now that the United States, Germany, Norway are conducting anti-submarine warfare drills in the Barents Sea at the same time as we're fighting a proxy war against Russia, of course, in Ukraine, which is now falling apart, and escalation is expected. So this seems to be very dangerous stuff. What do you read into, or what are you seeing in terms of what appears to be a bit of a provocation?
Well, I think it's much more than a bit of a provocation. I think it's it fits in with a pattern that has been ongoing for the last few months. And I wondered, one of the reasons I sent you the notification that I received about the increased activity near the Kola Peninsula in the Murmansk area and the Northern Fleet bases, was because I wondered whether or not anyone in Norway is aware of what's happening. Because Norway is very much in the line of fire if any of this should turn into something serious, which is not impossible at this stage. So I'm curious right off the bat before we go any further, is anyone in Norway paying attention to this?
No, not according to what I'm seeing at least.
Well, I think we have to go back to even before the Alaska meeting, which turned out to be largely a nothing burger, as we say. I think we've got to go back and listen to these remarks that were made by Lieutenant General Donahue back in June that ultimately came to light in July. He was the commander of U.S. Army ground forces in Europe, a light infantryman, and someone with a career that was largely in special operations. And he talked about the fact that, quote unquote, forces under his command could take Kaliningrad, the part of East Prussia that Russia kept after the Second World War, which is now sovereign Russian territory, in a few hours. That this place, which is not only a naval base and a production facility for naval vessels and equipment, but also a major hub for Russian military capabilities, especially in terms of rockets, missiles, strike, and air and missile defense. This is not something that we should take lightly, and the fact that he would go public and make such a statement really shocked me and many others because normally, senior officers do not make statements like that in public. In fact, that's the last thing you would want them to do. But what I'm seeing now is basically a pattern. And I think that he was saying things that I think both President Trump and probably Secretary Hegseth welcomed. I think that we are locked into this notion that bullying tactics will work, that you can bully or intimidate Moscow or Beijing or Tehran or anybody else, or for that matter, New Delhi, to doing whatever it is that you want them to do. I think it's very dangerous. And what I read this morning that struck me was not that it's the first time that we've had a lot of aircraft flying on the periphery of the Russian air defense identification zone. Uh, we've also got a lot of vessels carrying Tomahawk missiles. Uh, as you pointed out, not only Navy, but also Norwegian, and that they're moving towards Novaya Zemlya, which is very unusual. It's up on the Arctic. Then you also had a B-1, or excuse me, a B-2A bomber fly a route to Norway and back to the United States in the middle of all of this. And somebody said, well, this is because of the upcoming Zapad 2025 exercise that the Russians schedule years in advance. Everyone's notified, knows it's coming. I don't think that's really true. I think what we're seeing right now is an attempt to bully by practicing strikes on Russian facilities using bombers and missile carriers. And as you just pointed out, practicing for the purpose of attacking Russian submarines. All of this, I think, in the minds of President Trump, the Secretary of Defense, and probably Secretary of State Rubio, is designed to frighten or intimidate Moscow into doing whatever we think we want them to do in Ukraine. And of course, I don't see any evidence that that will do the trick. On the contrary, I think it's much more likely to really provoke the Russians, and you end up in a very tense environment where the slightest mistake could result in a confrontation that, truthfully, I don't think anybody wants. And of course, you have to look at this against the backdrop of the preparations down in the Caribbean for what people think will be a regime change attempt down in Venezuela. So the world, it seems to be being pushed by Washington and its allies into some sort of confrontation with Russia and anybody else that we determine we don't like, such as Maduro in Venezuela.
Well, the context is quite important because for Russia, its whole history has been the struggle to acquire reliable access to waterways, and it has three oceans on its western borders: the Arctic, Baltic, and the Black Sea. Now, it's I guess it's no secret that the key objective in this Ukraine war was to make the Black Sea a NATO lake. Well, in the Baltic Sea, though, you have the Poland, the Baltic states arguing that the Baltic Sea is now a NATO lake since Sweden and Finland joined. You also have the former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen arguing that we could now put a blockade on St. Petersburg if we choose, given that we now have Finland and Sweden in. A while ago, you had Financial Times publishing an article that Denmark could block Russian oil tankers from reaching markets in the Baltic Sea. And of course, the last sea, the Arctic, is also now becoming a bit more militarized with more US bases across Scandinavia. But but there's been a lot of reports as well about Finland, Lapland, that the Russians might attack it, which just happens to be up north next to the Russian Northern Fleet, which suggests that out of allegedly defensive motivations, we're now going to militarize that region close to the Northern Fleet as well. But this is something you might expect, though, if we're losing a war in Ukraine, the economic pressures on the rest of the world isn't working. Isn't this just another step up the escalation ladder?
Well, it certainly looks that way. The question is, if you're losing a war and there's absolutely no evidence that anything you can do will change that outcome, why would you take such irrational steps? Now, we know you pointed out something just a second ago. If you go back and look at Crimea, when the Russians opted to seize it very suddenly and very quickly, what people didn't know is that there were great plans in NATO to occupy Crimea, to use the naval facilities there for the very purpose that you outlined, to turn the Black Sea into a NATO lake, if you will. That didn't work because the Russians preempted us. And of course, the Ukrainians had made themselves rather unpopular in Crimea with both the Tatars that lived there, as well as with the Russians. So they had plenty of support for the population there. But the bottom line is that we've unambiguously failed in Ukraine. There's an unwillingness to admit this truth. And if we persist in provoking, as we are doing right now and have been doing for months, frankly, we will eventually get a reaction. And we may not like that reaction. Because let's be frank, we are not prepared for a major war with Russia. But Russia is prepared for a major war against us. And I think people in Washington have lost sight of that. There's something else here, too, that we shouldn't lose sight of. We have a problem in this country. It's an infatuation with air power. Air power is the equivalent of sex without consequences. You can bomb or missile attack people on the ground. There's no real response against you sitting in the United States or sitting in Western Europe. Nobody has the air defenses to stop you. You don't really accomplish anything other than alienating and offending people. But it feels good to the politicians in Washington that we're able to do that with impunity. Well, that's worked with Iraq. It's worked in Libya. It works in Africa. It's worked in many places. But it's not going to work with the Russians. And that's the danger, that we are pushing too far. If you stop and recall that when President Trump met with President Putin, he met him on the tarmac at Elmendorf Air Force Base. And parked on either side were all of these modern combat aircraft, F-22s and so forth. Or F-1, I don't remember the entire contingent, but they were all modern combat aircraft. And then suddenly, while he was greeting Putin, overhead flew this B-2 bomber with supporting aircraft. Putin smiled and shook his head and walked away with Trump. But this idea that somehow or another we're threatening everyone with the use of this air power, so if you don't do what we say, our air power will destroy you, is very dangerous, because we're now dealing with powerful states like Russia that can respond, and that war can reach us. In other words, the damage won't be limited to Ukraine. The damage will find its way into Western Europe and the United States. So what's really disturbing is that there's no requirement for it. This lie that the Russians are building up forces for the purpose of marching all the way to Paris is absurd. There's no evidence for that. There's no interest in that. That is a financially, commercially, and strategically stupid idea. The Russians know that. They're not interested in it. They want to settle this thing in eastern Ukraine, but they want to settle it in a way that prevents them from having to refight the whole war all over again in another 5 or 10 years, which is why they won't agree to a ceasefire. And by the way, nobody seems to note that World War I did not end with a ceasefire. It ended after negotiations were held and agreements were reached. And then a date for an armistice, a ceasefire, was set. So we've lost our minds that somehow or another a ceasefire is evidence for a solution, that a ceasefire is evidence for peace. It's not. It's just what it says it is. It's a pause. The Russians are not interested in a pause that will allow their opponents to simply rearm, refit, and go back to fighting again, although that's increasingly unlikely given the very terrible state of Western Ukraine. But nevertheless, that's their position. It's not an unreasonable one. So why not talk to the Russians and then set a date for a ceasefire based on a solution? It's because nobody wants a solution. Nobody wants an end to this for some reason. Now, when I say nobody, does that mean the Germans, the Poles, the Slovaks, Hungarians, the French, the Norwegians, the Danes, all of these peoples want desperately to sustain a war against Russia in Ukraine? I don't think so. But the governments do. And the governments are wedded to this project, because if they do anything else, it's tantamount to an admission of failure, a capitulation they can't afford, because that puts them at risk of admitting that everything they've been saying for the last 3+ years is a lie. And it is a lie. Russia never had any intention of moving much further than it already has. How many times have we talked about territory and said, territory is not the issue. The issue is destroying the enemy. And fortunately, thanks to the brilliant generals that run NATO, the Ukrainians have accommodated them and sent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men to be destroyed trying to defeat the Russians on the ground from what is really a strategic defensive posture. But nobody wants to tell the truth. So if you can't tell the truth, you try to keep this going. And simultaneously, Western Europe in particular, Great Britain right now is very close to simply collapsing financially. We're not far behind in the future. The French and the Germans are in terrible shape. So what makes you think sustaining these provocative acts against Russia is going to improve the situation for these globalist elites? I don't think it will, but I think that's what's going on. And I think Trump has simply signed on for it because he has this mentality that bullying people works. It doesn't. It angers them. That's exactly what he tried to do with Modi in India. And the Indians said, thank you very much. We'll leave your system. We'll join the new one that's emerging.
But I'm thinking only 3 months ago we had this attacks on the military base in Murmansk. Again, it's quite a long way away from Ukraine. Do you see this as being a strategic target for NATO if NATO would want to, not necessarily a decapitation strike, but something to cause significant disruptions within Russia and panic, if you will, lower its its fighting ability. Is Murmansk a strategic target in this sense?
Yes, it has been for a long time. It certainly was throughout the Cold War because of the Russian and then earlier Soviet submarine base and capabilities. The question is why? How does this help Europe? How does this help Russia? How does this help Ukraine? Nothing. Nobody benefits from this. This is a losing proposition. But the Russians, and this is the point that people need to understand, if we do this, they're prepared for it, and they will strike back. So instead of looking at Murmansk and saying, oh, look, we can make life for the Russians miserable by harming their access to the Arctic, harming their naval capability in Murmansk, why don't we look at the various things the Russians could do? Because they have missiles now that can reach targets anywhere in Norway all the way down to southern Portugal. Well, if that's true, how are we going to defend ourselves? And we know NATO has said categorically that they cannot defend more than perhaps 5% of NATO territory with their air and missile defense capabilities. Well, what have we completely lost our minds? If they came back and said, well, we could defend half of it, that might be worth exploring and talking to somebody about, but it's completely unrealistic if you say 5%, because the Russians can cover 90% of the area. So why would anybody do this? Again, I think it's the desperation in these capitals, and I think it's this childish mentality in Washington that somehow or another it's their way or the highway. And I think we've now seen in China evidence that everyone has said, your way is unacceptable, we'll take the highway. And there are costs associated with this. More than 40% of the world's population, its resources, mineral resources, oil, gas, everything, lies with this organization called BRICS. That's only going to grow in the future. So you're making enemies of people with whom you'd be better off trading, people who have things you need. But we've chosen the opposite. It's a deliberate choice, and it's stupid, and it's dangerous. And these things are not going to be taken lightly in the future the way they have been for the last 3 years. That's what worries me most of all. I think the Russians have reached the end of patience, or close to it.
It seems a bit too mad for for provoking a direct war with Russia in this way. But on the other hand, nothing these days seems to make sense. I mean, when the Europeans, they keep signaling that the security can only mean to defeat Russia. That is, when they have these military exercises, they only say we have to deter because, they're going to invade all of Europe for some reason. But when you have a policy of refusing diplomacy, refusing to sit down with the Russians, and only sending weapons, this is the only way of ending the war, is military defeat of the world's largest nuclear power. You do have some mad people, I guess, in power. I don't understand how they expect this to play out, or even this, coalition of the willing just meeting in Paris. They will make no concessions, only to continue the fighting. How do you make sense of this, given the direction of the war?
Well, if you go back through NATO, and this is true for when I served in it, it was rare, if ever, that you could get every member of the NATO alliance when it was 19, when it was 22, when it was 26 or 32, to agree to anything. And so you had this habit of establishing coalitions of the willing. Well, you don't need a coalition of the willing to defend Europe. Everybody agrees with that. That's what we thought NATO was about, remember? Defending Europe, keeping the peace. So if you can't get everyone to sign on, it's not because you want to defend Europe, it's because you are hell-bent to attack others. So we had a coalition of the willing for the Balkans, because not everybody signed on for the attacks in Bosnia-Herzegovina or Kosovo or Serbia. We shouldn't be surprised that we're back to the coalition of the willing for Eastern Europe, only this time, while we are foolishly supplying or promising to supply thousands of cruise missiles that could be used against Russia over time. We don't have them now. It takes time to build these, provided the Europeans pay us for it. The coalition of the willing is largely European. Now, that doesn't mean the campaign to drag us in does not continue. Of course it continues. And that's why I was saying you have this pattern that goes back to this General Donahue, this very stupid comment that he made. What he's saying is, first of all, not plausible and not attainable. And then secondly, it puts you at war instantaneously with Russia because it's Russian sovereign territory. There is no sense of the danger right now, and people need to wake up to this quickly. We are dangerous because we have this childish, bullying, tactical thinking. Do what we want or else, and we'll threaten you. What can we threaten people with? Well, if they bail out on our financial system, which is really what's going on right now, people are treating the dollar as a menace, as poison. Nobody wants it because the dollar is a way for us to pass our debt on to others. So that's not working very well. So then you turn back to the only other tool that we have to use because our economic strength is very limited. Our manufacturing base is being hollowed out, not by the Chinese or anybody else, but by us, the so-called elites, the CEO class, the shareholders, Congress. They've all profited from the destruction of our manufacturing base. So we don't have a lot that we can use against anybody else, so you turn to military power. And that military power is waning. It's waning because it's old. We're still resting on the foundations that were built over 40 or 50 years of the Cold War. Not that much new has come online. And now we see that Russia and China and other states, Iran is also one of them, have developed dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years. And that development should worry people in Washington if they're going to provoke them. There's no danger to us unless we provoke a war. Well, we should look carefully at the capabilities, and if we did and understood the consequences, we'd stop this pattern. But this pattern also extends to the media. The usual collection of retired four-star generals and admirals are coming on and say, oh, the Russians are weak. The Russians can't do anything. We can do this, we can do that, and we can dominate them, and this is the time, and Ukraine can still win. It was absurd. There's no truth to any of that. But that's being sold. And the American people don't know any better in most cases, and neither do the Europeans, but they need to wake up. I think there's a chance for Europe first because of the turmoil in Great Britain, France, and Germany. There's a good chance that these terrible globalist regimes that have done everything in their power to destroy their own countries by opening borders and allowing people to pour into the country who are not interested in being part of anything. They're interested in assimilating the people who are there. If that finally is recognized, then perhaps we can get rid of these terrible leaders and stop wasting our time on a war against Russia that doesn't need to happen and never did.
Well, I guess, reaching the final stages of this proxy war, my concern is that all our political leaders, they kind of chanted the same thing now for 3 years. That is, Ukraine is winning, Russia's weak, Russia's bluffing, Russia can be pressured, Russia's higher casualties than Ukraine. All of these narratives which seem to have the same purpose, that is to gain public support for a long war. But they are all fake narratives. Most of them don't make much sense at all. But again, if there's no dissent, there's no accountability. But once the war is lost, a lot of this will be exposed for what it was, just a big war propaganda campaign. So I'm kind of just going with the assumption that there will be some massive escalations now as we're losing this war. But why do you see the United States possibly partaking in this? Because I thought Trump's big game was to pull the United States out of this and leave this, dumpster fire on the Europeans. So how can you explain, these threats of invading Kaliningrad, taking 1 million Russian civilians, as hostages under occupation pretty much, and, all these threats now near Murmansk? How does this make any sense?
Well, because he and the leadership around him, I'm talking about Hegseth and Rubio and Radcliffe at the CIA, really believe that threats work. They think that you can bully people into doing what you want them to do. That's the essence of what's happening right now in Venezuela. That's what we're trying to attempt down there. Don't ask me to explain why, because I think it's ridiculous, but there are plenty of people that cheer this on. You have something in the United States population, in the electorate, I call it the bombs away club. And every time somebody somewhere in the world is bombed from the air, people say, oh, great. They think, bombing somebody somewhere, whether or not it makes any sense strategically, regardless of how helpless these people may be, is a demonstration of our greatness. And I also see something else that worries me. I'm beginning to see evidence that both President Trump and Hegseth, like Rubio probably as well, are becoming enamored with this thing called air power. We had a book years ago that came out called Victory Through Air Power. It's not a new development, it's simply an argument that with enough air power, you can do anything. And the air power fanatics have been arguing for decades that they can win everything and do everything without any air or ground or naval support. It's never worked. It's dangerous. But, it's appealing to politicians because use of air power doesn't immediately place people on the ground at risk. In other words, American soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines are not being killed because you're bombing from high altitude where you cannot normally be reached. Now, that's changing. We see a lot of evidence for that right now in the Iranian air defenses. We know that the Russian air defenses, air and missile defenses, are much better, frankly, than we thought they were, because for years they've been dismissed by the U.S. Air Force as nothing, ridiculous. And they still take this position that they're invincible and invulnerable. And I think that appeals to politicians because of the sort of sex without consequences. There's no consequence to what you're doing, or so you think, but they're wrong. And this is back to the other problem, that Americans collectively have lost their sense of what a war really means and what it costs and what's involved in it. And I don't think they understand that the war that we start on someone else's soil, in someone else's country, will now visit us as well. We shouldn't assume that we are going to be immune to strikes from other countries once we begin meddling in countries in the future. I think we're already there with the Russians. The Russians are that close to taking dramatic action against the Europeans. And they made it very clear that it doesn't make any difference to them what the coalition of the willing calls itself, peacekeepers, peace enforcers, doesn't make any difference. If they cross the border into Western Ukraine, they will be annihilated. So we need to come to terms with this reality. We're not going to survive this on this planet if we keep this up much longer. And the worst part, of course, is that I can't think of a period in our history when we were least threatened by great powers than we are right now. We have threats, but they're not from China, they're not from Russia, they're not from Iran, they're certainly not from India. So it's time for us to reconsider and reevaluate all of this, but there's no willingness right now.
Yeah, no, I hear the same now from Moscow, though, that the patience is wearing very thin. And when you have people like Merz on the news calling for deep strikes into Russia, the idea that the Russians will now just sit back and take this, I think it's quite foolish. There's and if they do retaliate, it's gonna come hard as well. But it doesn't seem to be. I don't know. It appears in Europe though that if you're a patriot, you should dismiss all of this, and if you express any concern that we might be walking into a direct war with Russia, then well, you're repeating Kremlin talking points, and you're probably pro-Russian. So it's this. We almost formed a suicidal pact here, where the only acceptable
Well, it's
argument is
also,
to be for.
as you know, Glenn, it's also an exercise in moral hypocrisy. Matt stands up there and calls President Putin a war criminal. It's absurd. On what basis? There's no fact associated with any of that nonsense. You can make a much better case for American presidents involved in war crimes over the last 25 years in countries like Iraq or Libya or Syria or elsewhere, where people, hapless human beings on the ground, have been annihilated. And their only sin was to have been close to a target. The same thing is true in Afghanistan. It doesn't make any sense. So it's all nonsense. But Americans, again, and I'm sure this probably applies to some extent in Norway and other countries in Europe, they want to believe that we always wear the white hats, that whatever we do is good, and whatever anybody who opposes us does is bad. If only the world were that simplistic. It's not.
And one can add that the Germans are also participating in their own genocide at the moment. So it is this, moral, as you say, hypocrisy. It is a bit over the top.
Yeah, and back in the 1980s when I was in graduate school, the joke was that the Germans had dropped sort of racial supremacy in favor of moral supremacy. They were always running around imitating the Scandinavians who tended to do the same thing. Oh, we're morally superior. We're not part of any of that. This is all wrong, and we know what's best. And of course, we see what's happening right now, and that's just the opposite of the truth. So I don't know what the answer is, except for the governments in Europe, in Berlin, Paris, and London in particular, to be changed, and changed fundamentally. If we get some version of what's already there, it won't last. We are moving into a revolutionary period now. And when the prosperity fails, when the world of abundance that we've known for so many decades stops, and people have trouble finding food to eat, they don't have jobs, they don't have heat, they can't fill the gasoline tanks in their cars, and all of these things come together, everything will change. It'll change very rapidly and very quickly. And it won't be pretty. It'll be violent.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the curse of having all these small wars fought far, far away from everywhere else for so long. I think all the generation who actually experienced what war means is largely gone. So, it's
You know,
the old truth. Every generation have to learn to respect wars.
I guess so, but here's a little anecdote, and this is something that people in Norway should be aware of. Everybody should know this. When the decision was made in London to declare war on Germany in 1914, keep in mind there was no particular reason to go to war with Germany. The Germans hadn't taken any action against the British. Germany presented no threat to the British. That was clear by 1912. This whole, as Neil Ferguson likes to point out, that whole maritime race and shipbuilding was over. Britain clearly won it. There was no reason for the British to try and ally themselves with a nation they had fought nonstop for almost 600 years. I'm talking about France. But a decision was made to go to war nonetheless. And one of the reasons that they went to war was that Winston Churchill, who at the time was a member of that cabinet, who was a big advocate for going to war, actually, he said, well, this whole war could be decided in an afternoon in the North Sea by the British fleet. Now, why anyone would think that a war could be decided against Germany and Austria-Hungary by a battle in the middle of the North Sea is a mystery to everybody. It made absolutely no sense. What are you going to do? Sail battleships into Berlin? No, not quite. So it was ridiculous. But they went ahead and declared war. And after they declared war, they decided they needed new military leadership, and the man's name was Kitchener. And at the time, he was sitting down in Egypt as the Governor General of Egypt and the Sudan and that region. And he came back. And Kitchener was asked to make a study and then give a presentation to the cabinet on how the war would be fought. And everyone was convinced this war would only last for a few months. Remember, they only had an army that they could export to the continent of about 150,000. Anyway, he walked in and he gave a presentation, and the presentation opened with the following words. This war will last at least 3 years. It will require the whole manpower and industry of the British Empire, and at least 2 million men in the field. Everyone was shocked. And people in the room listened to this, and they looked at each other and whispered, if we had known this, we wouldn't have declared war. But it was too late. He walked in, he told the truth. That's my great concern right now, that we're equally oblivious to the dangers. We don't understand the consequences. We're not ready. We need to stop behaving badly. We need to come to terms with the people that we insist are our opponents. But you see, we have become so self-righteous, so hypocritical, and so enamored of ourselves that we can't do it. That's dangerous.
I think these foolish calculations taking us deeper into war, though, that this process already started. If you remember back in March of 2022, it was said that Russia only had a few days left of missiles and artillery. If you put sanctions on them, the economy would collapse before the weekend was over. And of course, the whole world would join in on the isolation of Russia. So, and again, that was 3.5 years ago. So, and now we only go for escalation. But of course, if someone would have said this 3.5 years ago, that we're going to supply and start to do long-range strikes into Russia, probably people would have been a bit more concerned. But it's this slow incrementalism, this salami tactics that gradually pulls us into this, which makes it very difficult to pull out as well and accept the losses. Anyways, Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much. And yeah, very concerning development. So I appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Glenn. Bye-bye.